Well, good morning, everyone. If you're new with us, my name is Kasey, and I'm so grateful that you're joining us today, as well as those watching online. Can we give all those that are new with us and those watching online a warm welcome for being with us today? Yes, so glad you're here. Today we do begin a brand new series called Grit. Go ahead and get out your bulletins. We're going to follow along in the notes here. Have you ever met somebody with grit? I mean, have you ever met somebody that you know that you would say, man, this person has grit? As I was thinking about people who had grit, there are two people that came to mind. The first one is this lady right here. Her name's Bethany Hamilton. Many of you might know Bethany Hamilton's story. When she was 13 years old, she was surfing and was attacked by a shark, and she lost a limb. She lost, obviously, the limb that you can see is her arm right there. And then she lost this arm, but that didn't stop her. And I think about her, I think this is a gritty person. This lady had grit. She didn't let this stop her. She got back on a surfboard. She got back on that, and she not only did that, but she began to compete in this. And at 24 years old, she won one of the most prestigious championships called the Pipeline Surfing Championship at 24 years of age. I mean, that's grit to do that without a limb. Another person who's also paraplegic and more so is Nick Vujicic. I just massacred his name. I don't know Nick, but you have heard of Nick's story. Maybe you've seen him. He's been popular in news media, but his story is a story of grit. Born with an insurmountable situation without limbs, and he hasn't let his life without limbs stop him from doing things that we do in ordinary life, like fishing or camping or surfing himself. See, I see Nick's story, and I see a story of grit. And Nick right now is one of the best voices, one of the most powerful voices as an evangelist for the gospel of Jesus. And he's not letting his situation that he was born with stop him. He's enduring this, and he's leveraging that for the gospel of Jesus. See, that's gritty. And when I think of these people, I think of grit. I think these people have grit. And to help us understand what grit is, I'm going to go to the resource that your third grade teacher wanted you to go to, and you and I don't go to as often, and that's the dictionary. So we're going to leverage dictionary.com to help us understand what grit is. And I love the way that the dictionaries defined what grit is. And here's what dictionary.com says about grit. It's a firmness of character, an indomitable spirit, or pluck. I just love the word pluck. It's a fun word to say, but look at that indomitable spirit. You know what that means? It's a spirit that can't be defeated. It's this something within you that nothing can stop you. I see Bethany's story and I see Nick's story. And I see somebody that they had an indomitable spirit regardless if they were born in a situation or if a situation happened to them. This determined courage they had. Merriam-Webster defines grit this way: as a firmness of mind or spirit, an unyielding courage in the face of hardship or danger. That is grit. That in the face of hardship or in the face of danger, there's this unyielding courage. You know what that means? That your courage yields not to the danger. That your courage is unyielding regardless of the situation that you face. That's grit. Maybe you've met somebody that has had grit. Maybe it was a parent who had grit. Maybe it was a coach that had grit, a teacher who had grit, a friend that was close to you who you knew, and they had this courage to face a hardship that they dealt with in life, or they had this faith that couldn't be shaken in spite of the suffering they faced. And you know what happens in those moments as you see those people around you? It inspires you. At least when I see those stories, and many of you here today, and there's some of you that are sitting here today that have had the stories that I would say you have grit. Like one of our families, who their child was born with a medical condition that medicine couldn't fix, and there is a hardship that they face every day with what they have to do with because of the treatment and the medical state of their child. And through their perseverance and what they go through every day, it's a daily grit, it's a daily grind, but yet their faith is so strong in who God is, that despite it, their spirit is undefeated in that. Or one of our men who is like some of us and some of you who have gone through cancer. And prostate cancer didn't keep him down. But in this, his faith was stronger on the outside of it. Or another family who lost a loved one. And in the face of that, in this unsurmountable circumstance, when you think, I can't make it through, there was something that rose up inside of them, a grit that helps them face that difficulty and that hardship, that no matter what they face, that they can find it. Or another friend who had accusations against him in his workplace. And these accusations were unfounded accusations, yet he kept his faith in Jesus and kept his character intact and his integrity strong. And in that, he persevered doing what Jesus would have him do, which was the hard thing. And doing the hard thing, he had the endurance. And he built grit. See, when we hear stories like this, and when I hear stories like this, I don't know about you, but it makes me want to be like that person. It makes me want to have that type of grit, that no matter what I face in life, I can come out strong on the other side just like that. That those who go through the toughest of times, those who go through these difficult times, yet their spirit is indomitable. It can't be defeated. It doesn't mean they haven't had tears. It doesn't mean that there wasn't sadness or they were immune to the pain. It doesn't mean they were superpowered people. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that their spirits weren't broken by the pain. See, there's something inspiring about their stories that I want for me, and there's something I believe that we want for us in this. We want to have that type of grit. We all want to have that courage in the face of our difficulty and our hardship. We all want to have that type of character and that nothing can stray us away and our integrity can stay and do the right thing, the hard thing when it matters most. But here's something that you and I need to know, is we won't have grit without the path it takes to build grit. Is you're not going to have grit because you're born with grit. You can't be born with grit. And also, you can't inherit grit, and you can't borrow grit. You can't borrow it. You have to develop it. You've got to go through this process, and you've got to take the path. See, we can't have grit unless we take the path that builds grit. And here's the hard thing about this. Is see that grit that grit that inspired you came through a path that likely would scare you. I mean, the path of those people that you see is something that you like, the grit that they have, but the path they take to build that grit would scare you. And in our moments, we got to understand that we won't have our own grit. We won't have that own endurance, that own perseverance from just hearing the story from someone else's life. We have to build grit by living our own life. While the stories of others having grit, they do something for us. They give us the courage that we need to persevere, to stand strong, to endure through the hard things of life so we can build grit. And my prayer is that this series that we go through over the next 4 weeks, that this series, as we journey in this group, will help you see how you can build grit for you. How you can take the stories and the courage from other people and let that encourage you to build your own grit in your life. And the Scripture is a great place to start because the Scripture is full of gritty stories. The Scripture is full of gritty people who had grit. And when you read the New Testament, you read the stories of people who did the hard things in spite of the difficulty they face, and they had grit. And what we know of history and what history says about these first century disciples, these men and women who followed Jesus, you'll know this right here, that it takes grit to follow Jesus. You can't read the stories of this first century disciples without knowing that it takes grit to follow Jesus. These men and women were so firm in their faith that death itself wouldn't keep them from trusting in what they saw, a resurrected Jesus. They had grit. And these men and women were so firm, not just in their faith, but they were so firm in their character that the only accusation that could be brought against them was that they were men and women who had been with Jesus. These people were gritty. And it takes grit to follow Jesus. And I also know this, that following Jesus builds grit. See, it takes grit to follow Jesus, and following Jesus builds grit. You can't follow Jesus without becoming a more gritty person and building grit. Jesus, after all, epitomized what grit was. He epitomized a life of grit. He modeled this life, and following his way of life leads you and I to building grit in our own life. Now, allow me for a moment to take a couple steps backwards, because I want to identify a couple obstacles that we face, especially in our American culture, to building grit, because we got to recognize that there are obstacles in our life that are present in every one of us that are going to keep us from building grit. And the first one is this right here, is we naturally avoid pain and strive for comfort. There's a natural inclination that you and I have to avoid pain. We don't want to experience pain, and we strive for comfort. Everything you do in life, everything you buy in life, most everything you do, unless you bought a gym membership, because that doesn't go for comfort, by the way. I recommend you do that. But everything we do is really striving to make your life a little more comfortable, making you more secure in life. And in this, see, we don't want to experience pain. We don't want to, most of the decisions you make for your kids nowadays are say they don't experience the same pain you experienced. And your parents did the same thing for you. And don't get me started on what we're doing with our generation by helping them avoid risk and discomfort. But see, in this, what we do is we avoid pain. We avoid any conflict of it. We avoid any relationships that might become a little conflicting or might cause a little bit of pain. We try to get out of it. We try to escape it. We try to just slip away. But we avoid it at all costs. We avoid any conflict. We avoid any pain in our own life and our lifestyles. Man, our lifestyles are built to have a comfort. And our culture has a big influence on this. And here's what I know about this. See, avoiding pain and seeking comfort makes us less gritty. And also this right here. See, we naturally mask our weaknesses to appear strong. This is kind of like our human nature, isn't it? This is really the downfall of humanity, if you want to just kind of go to this level, is we don't recognize our limits. We don't recognize our weaknesses, if you will. And the reason is because we're so more insecure that we want to appear strong. And so what we do is we maximize our strength and minimize our weaknesses and mask our weaknesses. And that's a great leadership strategy, and that works great in the business world. But you know what it doesn't do? In many ways, by masking your weaknesses and hiding them, it doesn't build grit. And if we hide our insecurities, and I don't know about you, but I do this. I'll hide my insecurities. And what I'll do is I'll point out your insecurities to make me look strong. But that's not grit. See, living for our comfort and living for our comfort and ignoring our weaknesses doesn't make us gritty. It makes us wimpy. It takes away our strength. And masking our weaknesses makes us fake. And we don't want to be fake. We don't want to be inauthentic. And here's the reality. It also affects your faith in God and how you see him. See, when you live to be pain-free and you live for your comfort and you hide your weaknesses, you see God differently. You approach God differently. See, we approach God like he's Fix-It Felix in our Wreck-It Ralph world. We want him to come and just fix it. After all, most of your prayers, think about most of your prayers. What are they? Fix-it prayers. God, fix me, fix my wife, fix my spouse, fix my kids, fix the situation, fix my boss, fix my employees, fix my income, fix this, fix that, fix that. We see God as Fix-It Felix. And we approach him this way. What do we want? We want God to remove our pain. We want God to remove our suffering. We want God to change all of that. We want God to fix our problems so we can avoid any pain. We want that get out of pain-free card that we think God gives us. Or we see God as a God to equip and empower us. And here's the reason sometimes, and I'm just going to get straight here with you. Sometimes we want God to empower us so nobody else can have power over us. We want God to empower us so we can have power over people, to make us look good. So God, I want you to do something for me so I look better, or I feel better about myself. And we miss out on something when we do that. See, when we live for comfort and mask our weakness, we miss out on the power of Jesus. We miss out on the true power that God wants every one of us to experience. And God's power is revealed in our weakness, and it is at its best in our pain. That God's power is revealed in your weakest moments. It's going to be the strongest when you're at your limit. And when you read the scriptures, this is what we read about. See, it wasn't the comfortable and the powerful that God used and his power shone through. It wasn't that at all. It was those who suffered. It was those who were weak. It was those who experienced God's power. And Jesus' life models this for us. After all, he came in weakness. When he entered this world, he didn't enter with pomp and circumstance and enter into a comfortable lifestyle. No, what did Jesus do? He left his position of power to take on the position of a servant and to come in poverty. Why? Because he knew what it would take to have God's power revealed through him. It's the same path that we've got to take if we want God's power to come on us. See, Jesus had grit. These first century disciples, they had grit. They showed the courage in the face of death that all they would have to do is deny that Jesus was Lord. And history books would tell us time and time again, these first century disciples would not deny what they saw a resurrected Jesus. And their faith would be in Jesus and would follow him all the way to the point of death. That is the grit that I want. That's a grit I want for me. That's the grit I want in my marriage. See, I want my marriage to have grit. I want my family to have grit. I want you to have a grit like that. I want us to have a grit that no matter what we face, that no matter what you face, that you have grit. This is the faith that I want our next generation, that those of you that are in high school and middle school, this is the grit that I want the next generation to have. An indomitable spirit that nothing can defeat you. That in the face of persecution, in the face of others saying things against you, that you will have a faith that will be strong in those circumstances. See, it takes grit to follow Jesus, and these first century disciples show us that following Jesus builds grit. And the Apostle Paul knew this. See, Paul was against these many of these first century disciples. He was trying to snuff that whole following out as they followed Jesus. And as he began to follow Jesus, he had, before he ever followed Jesus, he had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. And as he followed him, Paul's story would show you and I that it takes grit to follow Jesus. And following Jesus builds grit. And in a letter he writes to this church that he starts in Corinth, he tells about his journey of following Jesus. And you see the path that he took to build grit. And this is what he writes. 5 times, he says, 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes -1. That's -1. This is the same amount of a whipping that Jesus received the night before Jesus went to the cross. He goes 5 times. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I mean, this is a gritty life. Paul had grit. Because it takes grit to follow Jesus, and he'll show you that following Jesus builds grit as he continues to say, I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I've labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. I've known the hunger and thirst and often have gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Paul had grit. That endurance, a perseverance, this firmness in his goal, in his character, this indomitable spirit, this unyielding courage in the face of hardship and in the face of danger. Because it takes grit to follow Jesus, and following Jesus builds grit. And Paul would continue to write to this church in Corinth. And as he continues to write, I believe he lets you and I into the secret to building grit. And this is what he says to this church. And we've got it because it's been preserved in history. So we can read it today. He says this, therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded to the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. That's gritty. Paul had grit. Now, in our American culture, we wouldn't say that. We wouldn't say he was strong. Actually, we'd say, Paul, you're weak. I mean, after all, that's not going to make you the CEO. That kind of lifestyle is not going to make you the CEO of any company. That's not going to put you on the magazine. That's not going to get you tweetable. That's not going to get you on LinkedIn as a very possible candidate for the job you want. See, that's not going to be the pathway to make you successful. It's not going to win championships, Paul. That's not the type of attitude you need to have. You need to approach it differently. So, see, he goes, you don't understand. I've learned something here. I've learned something. He goes, and I believe Paul would say that this right here is where true grit really lies. See, this is the grit I want for us, our families, and the next generation. It's a faith that we want. And I believe as Paul writes this to this Corinthian church, he writes it, and God preserves it so you and I can know how we can build grit. So let's look at this a little more closely, this last passage. This is what Paul says. Therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn. I want you to circle that word given, because that word right there, that phrase he means, is this right here. It's not used any other way in Scripture like it is here. He's like, I was gifted a thorn. I was gifted this. Like, it was a gift to me. I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me. Paul says, my pain, I saw my pain as a gift. And we don't know what Paul's thorn was. Some theologians have speculated about this thorn, and it's not important to know what the thorn is other than it was a pain. It might have been a physical weakness he was born with. Some people say he might have been blind, or it was a short stature, or he might have been bald, or he might have even had a limp because of something he might have went through. It might have been something that he faced, and because of that, it was a physical and something that came about through one of his travels. Some might even think it was a mental sickness like dyslexia or something that he had. Some might even think this was an actual person, an actual messenger who was going around and just making things rough for Paul, like a heckler for Paul. But regardless of it, this was a difficult thing for him. And we don't know if it was something that Paul was born with or if this was something that happened to Paul, but what we know is that was painful. And we know that Paul saw it as a gift. When's the last time you saw your pain or your difficulty or that hard thing you're facing in life as a gift? See, we see pains as burdens. We see pain as barriers, but Paul said, no. I believe he would just smile as he's writing this. He goes, I want you to know this is a gift. See, we build grit, write this in, by receiving painful circumstances as a gift. That hard thing you're going through right now, instead of trying to avoid it, what would it look like for your life to embrace it as a gift? To see the opportunity that your faith could grow and your trust in God could grow in that difficulty. Can you receive that hard thing, that hardship, that unfortunate circumstance as a gift? See, that's what it takes to build grit. And this is what Paul would continue to go to say, you want to build grit? He goes, do what I did 3 times. I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. 3 times. And maybe he says 3 times, and maybe he did 3 times because it was 3 times the night Jesus goes to the cross, right? He's in the garden. 3 times Jesus prays. And this is what Jesus prays. God, if it's possible, if I know you're capable of doing this, and if it's possible for you, will you let this cup, this suffering pass me by? And Paul prays 3 times here. But there's something inside Paul. He goes, I prayed 3 times that he would take it away from me. It's the same prayer that Jesus said, that, Father, I want your will more than I want my way. See, having grit doesn't mean we can't ask God to take away the painful circumstance. That's not what grit means. See, gritty people pray because, one, they believe that God is capable in his ability, and they trust in God's wisdom. See, gritty people pray believing in God's ability and trusting in God's wisdom. So we build grit. Write this in. We can build grit by believing God can take away our painful circumstance, yet trusting in what he sees is best. That's how we build grit. By believing that God is able. Yes, he is all powerful. He can totally change the situation you're in. He can take the pain away, the physical pain, the emotional pain, the relational pain. He could do that. And he is capable of doing that. But it's gritty people also not just believe that, but they trust in his wisdom and in his divine plan and his divine purpose. Yes, they believe God can heal and do the impossible. But there's this resolute trust that God's plan is best. And then Paul goes on to say, but he said, Jesus says to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I want you to underline that whole quote that he says Jesus says, because the words of Jesus are power and they're truth for us today. See, Jesus says, my power and my grace is sufficient for you. You know what that word sufficient means? Enough. Sometimes we don't think God's grace is enough for the difficulty we face. That's hard, isn't it? To trust that God's grace is enough. No, what's enough for some of us is, God, remove that from me. But Paul said, hey, I realize, and God gave me this secret here to know that his grace is sufficient for you, and his power is made perfect in weakness. And he goes, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. See, it takes grit to follow Jesus. Maybe you need to memorize this verse that God's grace is sufficient for you, for his power is made perfect in your weakness. See, to follow Jesus in the hard times and in the insurmountable circumstances, we need to receive God's grace. We need to receive God's grace. To follow Jesus with grit takes courage, and to understand, and it takes an undefeated spirit. To follow Jesus, it takes grit. And that only comes as you receive God's grace. That's just enough for whatever situation you're going through. That's just enough for that marriage difficulty. That's just enough for that parental, the circumstance you're dealing with your kids. It's just enough in the sickness. It's just enough in the thing that you're dealing with in your extended family or in your work. See, the grace God has for you is just enough. It's not less. It's enough for whatever you face in life. See, we can't build grit without God's grace. You can't follow Jesus in the hard times relying in your own strength, because your strength can't do it. When the things get hard, when life gets hard, we need God's grace to continue to do the hard thing in following Jesus, because sometimes it's in those moments we want to bail ship. But that's not what we do. See, following Jesus builds grit. And it takes grit to follow Jesus, because in this God's grace, we rely on God's grace, and it's sufficient for us. And he will give us the perfect amount, the perfect measure of his grace for every hard thing you face. That's what God does. For every difficult conversation, for every parenting struggle, every work encounter, every doctor's visit, every friend who turns on you, and every marriage struggle, God's grace is there for you. And when you trust in Jesus during every hard thing you face, you receive the perfect amount of God's grace. His power is made perfect in our weakness. And as you trust in God's grace, God's power will be made perfect. That word made perfect means made complete. That God's power is completed when we acknowledge our weakness. See, we build grit, write this in, by resting in God's grace so God's power can rest on us. We won't rest in God's power until we allow God's grace to meet us in the place of weakness. I want to ask you today, do you need grace today? Are you in a situation where you need grace? that you need God's power and his grace to meet you in your place of difficulty, because this is where grit is built. Grit is built when we rest in God's grace regardless of the difficulty or the hardship that we face. See, grit is not built by God's power changing our hardship. Grit is built by God's power resting on you to get you through the difficult time. This is what builds endurance. This is what builds perseverance. This is what makes us strong in our faith. And this is why Paul said this. This is why, for Christ's sake. He didn't say this is why for Paul's sake. This is not for Kasey's sake. This is not for my sake. Because if it were for my sake, I would say, God, change the situation. But there's a purpose greater than me. There's a purpose greater than you. There's a purpose that's greater than Paul, and it's God's purpose. For Jesus' sake, for Jesus' own purpose, he goes, I delight, and I can just see the smile come to his face. I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I'm so strong. Paul's saying, man, I do the hard things for a purpose that's greater than me. It pleased Paul to face these difficulties because Paul learned a secret. That there's delight, there's contentment in facing your difficulties. And there's delight and contentment in acknowledging you're weak. I mean, after all, isn't this what hardships does to you? I mean, when you face a difficulty, when you face a hardship, you know what that is? You've reached your limit. You've reached your place of weakness, because if you had the power to fix it and make it easy, you would have. But when you face that difficulty, when you face that impasse, you face that conflict, and you want to walk away, get out of it, and avoid the pain, God says it's embrace that, because that's the moment that your power stops and my power can rest on you. See, we build grit by being content in our weaknesses, because it's in suffering that we are made strong. It's in your suffering. It's at the moment that you have to give up and you can't fight back and you have to embrace your weakness and embrace the suffering that God's power will be making you strong. But we want out of the suffering. We want to avoid the pain. And Paul would say, don't pursue that path. Pray, believe God can change it, but if he doesn't, embrace it. Embrace the trial and hug the hardship. Cherish that challenge, if you will. Because God's grace and power make you stronger in your sufferings and your difficulties. And this is what we're going to be talking about over the next couple weeks. And here's a series big idea. See, grit is persevering with grace revealed in trials. You know what grit is? It's persevering. It's doing the hard thing and persevering and enduring that, but doing it with God's grace that's revealed. And the way God's grace revealed is in trial. That's what grit is. And you're either in a trial, you're either coming out of a trial, or you're going through a trial. And if you're here today and you're in a trial, this is my prayer for you. That today you will rest in God's grace. And if you're coming out of a trial, this is my prayer for you, that you can use your story and God can use your story of God's grace in your life to add courage to somebody else. And if you're about ready to enter a trial, I pray that you have the faith that God can take it away. But if God does it, may you embrace it. And I don't know where you're at in life today, but I want to ask you, do you need to embrace difficulty? Do you need to build grit? Today, I'm going to invite you, all of us, who want to follow Jesus. Because it takes grit to follow Jesus, and following Jesus builds grit, and Jesus models a life of grit. See, Jesus came to live the perfect life he couldn't live. He died to pay a penalty that we couldn't pay, and he came back to life to give us life so we can have grace in our trial. He came to be with us. There's no better way to remember that than in communion. So I'm going to ask you to stand right now. We're going to end service today in a response of following Jesus. And will you come and will you grab these elements and will you hold on to them? As we respond, and as you come today, I'm going to ask you to pray about something. Say, can you take a posture to say, God, I want to follow you. And may I receive your grace that's sufficient for whatever you're facing today.